Was it discussed? Was the Greensboro sit-in discussed much when you, in your household, having lived there when you were, 6, 10 years old, when you first started hearing about it?
I can't say we specifically talked about the Greensboro Four, but clearly, with me growing up in Greensboro, there was a huge sort of elevation to the civil rights movement during that time. And, at that point, Greensboro was a really segregated city with regard to neighborhoods, churches, even sports, where I grew up playing, basketball as a kid, Little League Baseball. There was not just not a lot of integration overall in town. And so it continued to evolve over the years, through the 60s and leading into the 70s when integration of schools started to happen. And I was an eighth grader when that happened, when busing started. And I think that's the first time that I really reflected back on, the progress that was being made. And so as a ninth grader and 10th grader, would take the city bus uptown on Saturdays with my friends, and we would have lunch at Woolworths. And so the history was never really talked about per se, but there was always an evolution towards progress. And so with that, we were exposed to others in the community that we might not have been exposed to. I will say the YMCA in Greensboro, particularly the Central YMCA, was a place that I spent a lot of time, and it was becoming more and more integrated. And on Saturday mornings, we'd play these pickup games, and there were kids that would really kind of come from all over Greensboro to have great pickup games. But none of that happened when I was a, 7, 8, 9 year old. But by the time I got to, high school, that's where we had some of our best pickup games.
When was, and this may be very difficult to answer, but do you remember the names? Do you remember when you first started hearing about them? Or were they even local celebrities in the African American community, the ones that did the sit in?
Well, ironically, the names started to really surface because of their kids. So David Richmond, Chip Richmond, who was a great athlete that played at Greensboro Dudley High School, ended up going to play college football at Wake Forest. I really found out more about his family's history because of the son. And then as my parents started to teach me a little more about what had happened when I was growing up and they were marching, and I had an uncle that was a police officer on the Greensboro Police Force that was actually arrested during the Civil Rights Movement by his own comrades. A lot of that history, really started to surface when I was more in like junior high school and high school, as my parents would discuss with me the progress that had been made. But a lot of it, really came to the surface around the integration of schools. And so, it was an evolving story that continued to grow and evolve, and I learned more even, when I was in college. And then when I started practicing law and started to really dive more deeply into the community and learn a lot more of the history of, who Henry Fry really was, as a leader in the African American community that made it to the North Carolina Supreme Court. But it wasn't like we were, as kids, pounded with this history of just how courageous these four young men were at North Carolina A&T. It just was part of the, growing pains of what Greensboro represented as a community that happened to be on the forefront because you had these young men that started the movement. You had Bennett College, who was an all-women's school in Greensboro, where my mom actually attended. But I can't say my parents spent an enormous amount of time really looking back as much as really encouraging my brother and I to look forward. And this is a progress that has been made. You guys should go and try to get great education so you can keep the progress going, and you should befriend others from around town. And my brother ended up on the travel basketball team at the Central YMCA. So his travel team was integrated, and they traveled all over the country. And my parents became great friends with Judge Albright, who was a Superior Court judge whose sons played with my brother. Wyatt Smith, who's an executive here in Charlotte with Bank of America, was on that team. But you got to remember, my brother's 10 years younger than me. So when I was his age at 9 or 10, I was playing in the recreation league, and our teams were very segregated. Now, we'd go across town and play other community centers in other neighborhoods that were all white teams. And so it was really refreshing to get to high school and be able to play on integrated teams. And every team in the city was integrated, and no one really thought about the segregation in the past, and we all became friends. And I think, as I reflect back and think about just the impact that the Greensboro Four had they not done that, the things I was able to experience as a high school student and athlete, I wouldn't have been able to do. And my brother wouldn't have been able to do it at a very young age as an 8-year-old, being able to go to the Central Y and play on an integrated basketball team and have friends from other races, and my parents become friends with their parents because they were traveling together. So it was all a process of growth and progress in Greensboro, which is really surreal to think about. Greensboro being sort of the centerpiece of that, and me having grown up right in the middle of it, but not focusing on it.
You talk about your parents, and I was doing some research about you growing up in Greensboro, and something stood out to me so much about your parents, and I even made comment to someone in the newsroom about it this morning. Obviously you've had ridiculous success in your career, but what your parents did, I could argue that was actually harder for them. How many people in the 50s, African-American community in the 50s in the South, actually each had their masters, male and female. I mean,
Right.
especially the female side.
Right.
Before you were even born.
Right.
That's ridiculous.
Right. No, I agree. And honestly, there's no way that I've been able to have the opportunities I've had without both of them being so well educated and pushing me and my brother so much towards education. And it wasn't just hearing them talk about it, but it was knowing that they had done it. Now, I was in the vast minority of that, and I understood that a lot of my teammates at Windsor Community Center or my teammates from American Federal Little League baseball team, they came from completely different backgrounds that didn't have the opportunities or weren't being pushed by a two-parent family whose parents really saw the value that education could have on their future. And that's what I'm most appreciative about, because as much as I loved playing sports, my parents always emphasized that before you go out and play basketball in the afternoon, you're going to do your homework. And my mom, when I come home from school, with my mom being a kindergarten and first grade school teacher for 35 years, nothing was more important than education. And so, like every other kid, I wanted to be a pro athlete, but I'm in that 99.8% that wasn't good enough to be a professional athlete. But them pushing me to not only pursue my undergraduate degree and major in something that I could build a career around, but also go back and pursue my master's degree like they had done. And then they even pushed me to pursue my law degree, because if I wanted to do what I thought I wanted to do as a profession and represent professional athletes, I needed to get that law degree. And so that was very unique back in the day. The other thing that I was very fortunate to have done was I grew up in Providence Baptist Church, which at the time, and still is, the church that a lot of the professors in North Carolina A&T attended. The chancellor at North Carolina A&T, Lewis Dowdy, attended that church. Henry Fry attended that church. A lot of the African-American doctors and lawyers in town were members of that church. And so we had real role models in that church every Sunday that we could look to that were successful in their business careers. They were very involved in the community. They were accessible to be mentors to us. I can remember sitting down with Dr. Dowdy as a 7-year-old. I still have that picture where I have a little suit on and a little tie, and I'm interviewing him and asking him questions about his role as chancellor of North Carolina A&T State University. Well, that was my first real time to dress up and do an interview with someone. And so to be able to have that kind of access because of my parents and their being involved in Providence, I think really influenced my life. And then as a part of Providence, we had a SAT prep course that two professors at North Carolina A&T held for all of our students and other students in the community to really push them all to go to college, and this is what it takes to go to college. I mean, those are the kind of things I think that were unique about Greensboro that sort of galvanized the African-American community as education was pushed on really all of us to be able to understand that it can be a difference maker. But it was all parental leadership, and then the leadership within Providence, and then, you know, in the schools. And even when the schools were segregated, I went to Blueford Elementary School, which is literally right behind Dudley High School. I went to Lincoln Junior High School, which is across the street from Dudley High School. I was supposed to go to Dudley until we moved into the county as I was going into the 10th grade. But some of my best teachers, including my aunt, who was a teacher at Blueford Elementary School, they were so focused on trying to make sure that we got a great education as well. And we would have the opportunity to compete, learn how to read by third grade, all the things that we're trying to work on there to make sure every kid has a chance. Fortunately, back in the day, there was so much being invested in our community and our kids, and a lot of those elementary school teachers graduated from North Carolina A&T or graduated from Bennett and never left Greensboro.
You know, I think what gets overlooked a lot of times, because Clarence Henderson, I spoke with him. I did about a 35-minute interview with Clarence Henderson. He wasn't there for day one in the sit-ins, but he was there on day two and the rest of the time. Mm-hmm. And he still lives up in the Greensboro area. And he made it clear to me, and he wanted me to make sure everyone knew about it when we talked about it, was, yes, all the ones that were doing the sit-in, you know, were African-American. He said, but more important, they were all in college.
Right.
You know, they weren't just people from, you know, the street or the neighborhood. These were actually educated people doing that. The education in the African American community, especially in the 60s growing up, was that one of the hardest things?
Well, I think it was. And, you know, one of the things that I think also gets overlooked is you had students from Bennett College who started participating after the movement got going, that would go in and participate in the sit-ins, and even high school students from Greensboro Dudley that wanted to go and participate. Sandra Hughes, who is a 40-year anchor person at WFMY, our CBS affiliate, even as a high school student, begged her dad to allow her to go participate in the sit-ins and also participate in the marches. So what a lot of people don't also realize is simultaneous to the sit-ins and even after the integration of lunch counters, there was still a civil rights movement that you had leaders like Jesse Jackson leading nonviolent marches within Greensboro, that a lot of the leaders in the city participated in. My parents were two of them. I just heard the story Saturday as my mom and I drove to our luncheon, that in 1960, they were marching with Jesse Jackson and the four leaders of the Greensboro Four. And the only reason my parents didn't get arrested was because they had me with them, and I was too young for them to take my parents off to jail. And so there are all these stories out there that, you know, we all are learning about and finding out about. And probably the thing that I'm most thankful about with my parents is they didn't focus on the negative. They didn't focus on, wow, this is everything we had to go through for you to have an opportunity to at least have a fair chance to do something positive with your life. They focused on, okay, this is the progress that's been made. Now it's up to you to make your own way and get yourself educated, and certainly we'll help you. But think about the future and what you can do to impact and bring people together more over time rather than reflect back in any negative way. And that's what I've tried to do, honestly.
That growing up and having that background, it obviously looks like it led to something that occurred not too long ago, where you had the fortitude, and I've talked to Republicans and Democrats up in Raleigh about you, specifically about you, and they each basically credit you, on almost solely you, for leading the drive to help change the bathroom bill. That you were so instrumental, and one of the community leaders obviously here is like, look, this needs to change. And I'm not talking about like homosexuality and stuff like that, but just your background and trying to make sure everyone's treated fairly. How much of that goes back to when you were a kid having to go to segregated schools?
You know, it's interesting. I really believe that I've been given a lot more credit than I deserve in the repeal of House Bill 2. It was a complete team effort. We had 5 or 6 of us that went for almost a year to really fight to try and have the bill repealed. Number one, because it was the right thing to do. But number two, because we really need to get our economy back on track, and none of us believed in discrimination of any shape, form, or fashion. Now, with that being said, I think the real difference maker was Dan Blue, and he's the Senate minority leader. But I think when he sat down, and we were all at a big meeting at the governor's mansion. We had Democrats, Republican leadership. The governor was there. Obviously, Dan Blue and Darren Jackson from the Democratic side. We had Senator Berger, we had Speaker Moore. But I think when Senator Blue reflected back on his time, being a little older than me and having gone through segregation, really brought that up and equated it and mentioned me as probably the only other person in the room that might be able to understand what discrimination actually felt like. I think really got everybody's attention, and it really got everyone, I think, to let their guard down and realize that if we were going to save our state, if we were economically, that and progress as a state and be able to recruit companies from around the world that don't believe in discrimination, then we all had to pull together. And I think it was him extending that olive branch to Senator Berger, and Senator Berger accepting it, and Darren Jackson extending the olive branch to Speaker Moore. I think we as corporate leaders, and it was Charles Bowman and Andrea Smith from Charlotte from Bank of America, Ned Curran, the 4 of us were from Charlotte, and then there were 2 gentlemen from Raleigh, the former CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield, who was phenomenal and eloquent and had great relationships. And there was another gentleman who was the CEO of medical insurance from North Carolina, Dale Jenkins. The 6 of us were really the ones that worked together from a corporate standpoint, but it really took the legislative leaders to come together and to have Senator Blue and Senator Berger stand in front of the Senate and present this bipartisan compromise bill that really got it done. Now, I probably am getting more credit than I deserve because our league made the right decision in pulling the highest profile event that happened to be coming up after House Bill 2 was passed. But who I also give a lot of credit to is our commissioner, Adam Silver, in number one, having the foresight and the courage to do that, but then number 2, to agree to work hand in hand with us to try and help have the bill repealed. And then I'm thankful that he gave me the authority to go to Raleigh and speak on behalf of the NBA and what our league stood for, and if we got the bill repealed, what would be on the backside of it that would help reinvigorate our economy. And so I just happened to be the person that got thrust into that role, and I'm thankful that the commissioner had enough confidence in me, and quite frankly, our corporate leaders that joined me allowed me to be a little more out front in speaking and on behalf of the league. And then Senator Blue and Darren Jackson really extending those olive branches. That's how it happened. But you're right. Having grown up in a segregated community, in school, even going into the 8th grade, opened my eyes. Even in high school, I'd see, certain signs of racism that still existed because I ended up going to a rural high school that was 90% white and maybe 10% black.
And I would guess same thing at Campbell.
Well, Campbell for sure. It was a Southern Baptist institution that I was fortunate to get a basketball scholarship to attend, but certainly in rural Harnett County, and then having my dad having grown up in rural Pitt County, in Farmville, and my mom having grown up in rural Cleveland County in Kings Mountain, all of that is kind of part of what I learned as a kid going to visit my grandparents on both sides. I was exposed to a lot of that, and certainly at Campbell, it was an environment, especially in the outer line cities and communities, that there wasn't a lot of integration. And so I was fortunate that Campbell had such a great support system internally that we all got along well, we all coexisted. I had the opportunity to get what I think was a great education and major in economics and have the opportunity to go back and get my graduate degree there. But you can see on the peripheral of what was around the school that there hadn't been a lot of progress yet. Now, it's completely different now if you go to Buies Creek and see what's going on and the diversity within the school. There weren't any African-American professors when I was there. In fact, when I was in grad school, I was the first to actually teach a course, and that was quite an experience. But the school's totally different now, and it's great to see how even that rural community has evolved and grown, and people are more open to diversity and inclusion of all types.
Clarence Anderson also said that outside of the actual sit-ins, that one of the more turbulent times in the Greensboro was the institution of busing. Do you remember your first day going to an integrated school?
Oh yeah, that was 8th grade. And just, it's ironic.
Like that actual day?
Oh, yeah.
You remember being nervous or anything like that?
No, well, this is the ironic part. So my mom taught in the Greensboro school system, and so they had just built a new junior high school on the other side of town in the affluent area of Irving Park. And my parents, and that's when we had freedom of choice in the 7th grade, my parents and 3 other parents decided to carpool me and my friends over to Mendenhall Junior High School, which was brand new, but in the affluent white neighborhood. My mom thinking education may be somewhat better. And so I went through that year, and there were probably 2% African American at Mendenhall. The next year, the 8th grade, when they started busing, I literally had to walk to school because it was across the street from where I lived on Tuscaloosa Street. And so the other kids were being bussed in. And so I can remember that first day. It really didn't impact me and bother me as probably some of my friends who hadn't gone to, white school like I had in the 7th grade and really hadn't been exposed to an integrated classroom, because 2nd grade through 6th grade, it was all black for me. 7th grade, I went to Mendenhall, which was an eye-opener for me, but I became friends with so many of my classmates. So the next year when busing started, I'm sure it was like a major eye-opener or a major culture shock for a lot of my friends that hadn't been in an integrated classroom. But for me, it was actually pretty easy.
Is that why going to Buies Creek maybe was an easier transition for you? Because, having gone to school, and having a lot of white friends, like you said, in the 7th grade and the busing and all that, did that make it going to a small Southern Baptist school easier?
Well, I think even my high school days, because as I mentioned, Southeast Guilford High School is out next to the affluent area of Forest Oaks in Greensboro, and it was 90% affluent white. There was, some rural, sort of middle class whites that came from Climax, but really the only African American students came from my neighborhood, which was off of Youngs Mill Road. And so we had to get along, had to become friends. They had to be my basketball teammates. I was also very fortunate that my peers voted me as vice president of student body at Southeast my junior year. And I was president of my senior class at Southeast. And again, that's, we were in a vast minority. at Southeast. But to me, it was all about getting along with everybody and having friends of all races. I really didn't look at it as a black-white thing. And I think I'm really appreciative that my parents really pushed me to be more open-minded as a kid growing up. And my parents didn't come out of the civil rights movement bitter. They came out and, as my mom got transferred around to teach at different schools, she became friends with her coworkers who were nice to her, black or white. And so that's really the way they raised my brother and I. And so maybe a little different than maybe some of my friends' parents. But I think that's what allowed me to be able to, go to Campbell, enjoy it. They sent me to basketball school there as a kid, as a camper, from ages 8 to 18. And so I knew Bowie's Creek. I knew Coach Danny Roberts. That was the one week in the summer that my friends and I would go down, and there'd be kids from all over the country, from all different races that were in camp. And my campers, we'd eat lunch together, we'd go play basketball together, we stayed in the dorms together. So for me, going to Campbell was really not that big a culture shock or adjustment. It was just, part of what Bowie's Creek was, which I enjoyed.
And it's interesting now that you talk about that and accepting everyone and stuff like that. I know there's a lot of city council, I've been to a lot of the city council meetings. You were instrumental in getting the DNC here. Obviously, if an event happens here, it doesn't happen without your approval. The RNC coming here. What made you decide, yes, we did the DNC, but we also need to do the RNC. We need to have both sides.
Well, this is the Spectrum Center is a city-owned facility. We are just lucky enough to be able to run and manage it for the city. And, once the city made a decision that they wanted to pursue the Democratic National Convention in 2012, we were all in to do whatever we could to make it a reality. We felt like if we were able to host a successful DNC, it would allow us to make a run with our city and our corporate leaders for the next big event, whatever that might be. Was the ACC basketball tournament, CIAA tournament, continue hosting that, or the ACC men's basketball tournament, or the RNC. And so when the opportunity came along, particularly when it's led by Mayor Lyles and the city council and the corporate community, we looked at it the exact same way that we looked at the DNC. This is a huge economic impact opportunity for our region, for our city, for our state. We've got to do the same thing we did for DNC, be a great partner, make sure we partner with the local organizing committee and activate the way we need to activate to make sure it's successful. And that's how we look at every big event that comes to this city, this region, and potentially comes to this arena. And so for us, it was the exact same thing.